Det ska handla om avancerad kulturekonomi, om hur kultur kan eller bör vara en drivkraft för regional och lokal utveckling, ekonomisk utveckling inte minst. Och därför så ber jag Professor Pier Luigi Sacco att komma upp här. Welcome up to the stage, Professor. Ge honom en applåd. Welcome, Pier Luigi Sacco, from the IULM from University in Milano, and you are also an advisor to the EU Commissioner of Education and Culture, and we are very happy to have you here. You'll be talking about culture as a platform for creating economic value, which has become a speciality of yours, isn't it?
Probably, yes.
Probably, yes. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me here. I'm often coming to Sweden, I must say, and in some sense, I will always have to be grateful to this country because it's been the first country in Europe that has really been receptive to these ideas in the very early stage, probably also because one of the reasons is that, according to my paradigm, basically Sweden is the best that there is in Europe in many different respects. But nevertheless, I think it's an interesting moment today to discuss about the impact of culture, not only from the economic point of view, but also from the social point of view, and especially understanding how these two aspects cannot be disconnected, and better, it's more appropriate to really interrogate ourselves on the potential for economic development of culture if we consider the social channel through which value is created. That, as I'll explain, is today the real challenge, and is today the real field of opportunity, much more than the traditional to economic-focused kind of not simply explanations, but also paradigm to streamline culture into the mainstream development paradigm. Well, when we speak about culture, we tend to ignore the fact that it's actually a very complex geography. And there are sectors which belong to the so-called non-industrial core, so sectors that cannot be industrialized, like performing arts, we are in the theater today, or visual arts and heritage museums and archives. Very often, many of the contradictions in the policy debates and also in political debates stem from the fact that people simply don't distinguish between the structural characteristics of the non-industrial core, so sectors that are not made to be industrialized, that cannot be companies. A theater cannot be a company, a museum cannot be a company, and they shouldn't be asked to become such. Whereas on the other hand, there are of course cultural industries, the 5 classical ones, publishing, cinema, music, radio, television, and video games. Yes, video games is a cultural industry. It's an interesting test whenever I give classes even to, young people, and ask, listing the first 4, what's the 5th cultural industry? Nobody thinks of video games. Because strangely today, we still have a resistance to consider video games as part of culture, exactly like cinema was at the beginning of the 20th century, by the way. So, but this of course is becoming established. And then there are the creative industries, which are of course industries where the creative content is very important, but they also have a strong instrumental dimension. So if you consider design is not just appropriate to consider, let's say, the aesthetic properties of a chair. You have to sit on the chair. If the chair is not comfortable enough, that's bad design. So that's the difference between a chair in a museum and a chair as part of design. And the creative industries have this characteristic, and this is why we distinguish. And then, of course, the digital platforms, what basically hic sunt leones, there is a change in geography that basically mutates every day, and it's too complicated today even to map. Okay? So we are speaking of a very complex sector, which, by the way, is characterized by very strong interdependencies between the subsectors. And this is one of the reasons why people who are not insiders into the cultural and creative professions tend to be immensely naive when they try to discuss this. And they draw absolutely ungrounded conclusions. So it's very important to have a framework that enables us to understand what's the peculiarity of creative production, To do this, we have to consider very quickly the three basic paradigms that characterize creative production, culture and creative production, and that in some sense reflect into the mapping, into the list that I just showed you. That is the result of a very complex historical process that we will now very quickly review. There are so many different phases that have characterized the emergence of the regimes that we have today. Don't even try to read. I mean, it's too complicated. This is the kind of slides you should never project. But nevertheless, they are useful when you review it afterwards. So to make it short, there's been a very, very long part of our history in which we have been producing culture in the so-called grassroots regime, which is what we could call the culture zero regime, which has been very important for us. In some sense, we are returning to it in certain respects. I'll show this in a moment. But you know, the interesting thing about this very, very long epoch of human creation is that the role of the artists has not been established as such. So to have artists, and especially socially recognized figure that we call artist or a creative producer or whatever you want to call it, we need to arrive at the first structural regime, which is patronage. The early stages of patronage can be found in the classical Greece. In particular, theater festivals have been in some sense, a rehearsal of what is the modern concept of patronage, but with a big difference that explains why we speak of proto-patronage, and we don't consider this as the first defining moment, at least in the Western tradition. Of course, we are speaking about the Western tradition. The East is very different, and of course, we would need much more elaboration. The point is that the people who provided the resources for the theater festivals, that were, of course, people with very high public profile, they were obliged to do so. It was like military conscription. You were, in this case, you were asked by the city to fund a certain theater festival, and on the success from the organizational, financial point of view of your funding, it depended your later public career. So in this particular case, you cannot speak properly of a patron because you don't make a choice. The very fact that you are part of a certain social structure implies that you have to patronize. But the really interesting thing happens when patronage becomes a purposeful choice. And in particular, this comes with the very important social innovation that is at the root of the patronage regime, which is the invention of the figure of the artist. So for example, in the case of Homer, we don't know whether Homer was a single person or a collective person, but at least there has been a willingness to identify with Homer the creator of a certain cycle of epics, okay? In the case of the pyramids, just to make an example, nobody cared to record the name of the people who designed the pyramids. It was simply irrelevant. The only thing that was relevant were the kings that commissioned the pyramids. That's the difference. So the birth of the patronage regime as we know it today is linked strictly to the emergence of the figure of the artist as a socially identified role. And in particular, this leads to the classical patronage model that emerged in ancient Rome, especially in imperial Rome. Patronage emerged as a solution to a moral problem. To be a public figure in the Roman classical culture, just before the empire, the interesting thing is that with the empire, things will change also in a very tragic way, in a sense. But interestingly, with classical patronage, Roman patrons solved this problem. To be a public figure, you should be a parsimonious figure. It's very important because Roman has a frugal agricultural background, and it's very important for the moral complexion of the public figures that you are, in some sense, a frugal man. But in imperial Rome, in which you are immensely rich if you occupy certain types of public position, you cannot be literally frugal. So what do? You give out your resources to artists. So in this case, you solve a moral problem by interpreting your frugality as a way to devote resources to the enrichment of the human soul, so to speak, okay? So this is basically the root of patronage as a solution of a moral dilemma. And what's important about the classical patronage, about all the forms of patronage, is that we don't have the technology to create mass cultural markets. So if you have poetry, the only way to actually circulate poetry is to copy it by hand. The same for music, only live performances allowed, painting and so on. At the same time, the audience is very limited because it's the circle of the patron that basically determines the audience, and it's the patron that decides who has to be financed, so what kind of art should be patronized is just depending on the patron tastes, and there's no value added generated, so you do not produce any economy, you don't get rich by patronizing art, but you use resources that were gathered through other channels to support the artist, okay? Strategic patronage, as it emerged in the Middle Age, in the medieval church, and then in the Renaissance, especially in Italy, but not only, is particularly interesting because it associates cultural commissioning to risk-taking. Strategic patronage is particularly interesting and today almost unthinkable because we have a government style in which your political decisions are shaped by also, not only, but also by your art commissioning choices. What happens in the Medicis Florence, for example, is evident in this regard. In many cases, really, the management of the political strategy is so complexly intertwined with the commissioning of artworks that today we marvel at the level of sophistication and risk-taking that was implied by this. Of course, the implication is that patrons had to be extremely well acquainted with artists. They had to know the artist's psychology very well. Lorenzo, for example, in his private house, had a garden of Greek sculpture in which all Florentine artists could go and study, and that was for him the perfect turf to create a personal relationship with the artist and really build partnerships, not only artistic, but political partnerships that were so important to build his own political career. Public patronage that emerged after the after the French Revolution is particularly interesting because it shifts the notion of patronage from the individual patron, Lorenzo or whoever, to the public patron, which in this case is the state. It becomes impersonal. But with this, it arrives the moment in which the patronage choices are actually made by experts, by the gatekeepers, and this marks the invention of the very European distinction between highbrow culture and lowbrow culture. Highbrow is what the expert decides it's good enough to meet their standards. Lowbrow is all the rest. Interestingly, this is in some sense self-fulfilling. Of course, there are objective, so to speak, ways to tell one from the other, but not so rigorously, and it's very difficult to defend this on a philosophical basis. But the really important thing is that with public patronage, the audience expands, and culture starts to really absorb resources in the moment in which public policies in the cultural field begin to emerge with the birth of the nation states. And in particular, and this is very important, the access to highbrow culture, despite the fact of the universalistic ambition of the French Revolution, access to highbrow culture becomes a sign of bourgeois distinction. So it's very important to understand that with public patronage, there is this very strong association between access to certain types of cultural consumption styles and social recognition, which is something that today has become, of course, a real issue when still today in Europe we face issues of feeling of exclusion, lack of inclusiveness in terms of cultural participation, especially for people with low educational levels and so on and so forth. The cultural proto-industry, it's an interesting passage, and I would like to spend 30 seconds on this. After the Industrial Revolution, throughout the 19th century, we have a Europe in which an enormous mass of people is moving to the cities to exploit the opportunities created by the Industrial Revolution. These people are getting more and more affluent. These people have some free time, and they have even some money to spend. So they would like to have some mass entertainment. But what's the problem? The problem is that throughout the 19th century, we don't have the technology for mass entertainment. Just to make an example, people would like to read novels, but novels are terribly expensive because if you want to buy a book in the 19th century on average, and if you are, let's say, factory worker, it's like buying, let's say, a refrigerator. It's something that really takes a big part of your budget. So how do you solve the problem before the technology is there? Basically, you, exactly like the fridge, you buy the book in installments. How? The book is published as chapters on the newspapers, Dickens. Dickens basically published, and all the writers of the 19th century published the first edition of their novels on newspapers, chapter by chapter, in very inexpensive paper, so that everybody could read it. And by the way, this influenced a lot the narrative structure of TV serials today, because of course when you publish in installments, you have to convince the public to read the next chapter. So at the end of each chapter, you have to create a suspension that everybody wants to know how it's resolved in the next chapter, okay? But this was basically an artifact of the economic constraint, of the fact that you were selling the book by chapters. Interestingly, or think of what happens, for example, for the music industry. You don't have records still, but you have, for example, the possibility to print the scores of opera arias, for example, and Ricordi becomes a mogul of the music industry by selling Verdi's arias, I mean, score by score. But so you have a proto-industry in which you invent ingenious solutions to create a mass market, but you don't have the technology. So the real revolution arrives when the technology comes. And the technology is an impressive stream of innovations that arrives basically from the mid-19th century to the early 20th century, but it actually goes to the market in the 20th century. And it has to do with cinema, with radio, with modern printing techniques, with photography, and with recorded music. And it's incredible that basically it happens at the same time. So we have an extremely quick transition from a regime in which there's no possibility of technological reproduction of content on a regime in which everything can be reproduced. And interestingly, at increasingly cheap prices. What's the problem? The problem is that now we have a possibility of a mass market, but then from the European point of view, this is annoying. And it's annoying because if we have a mass market in which people judge what they want and how much they like certain types of things, now the conditions for success are determined by market response and not by the judgment of gatekeepers. So the high-brow, low-brow, in some sense, dividing line becomes, from Europe, a line of resistance towards this idea of an industrialized mass market for culture that basically generates a negative reaction. So the interesting thing is that the real development of the new regime of culture and creative industry happens in the United States, which are the ideal context for this to happen. They need a narrative, they need technological reproduction in a country which is very big and which is very diverse and very fragmented, and they have no problem whatsoever with the high-brow, low-brow distinction. Of course they come from Europe, but they are creating a new social space. And this new social space, the inheritance of this distinction is not so important. So interestingly, we have a first phase in which we develop completely new business models. We create the star system in the modern sense. For example, the movie studio in the US, it's really an invention of a completely new business model that is created out of this commercial culture. And we have the golden era of mass entertainment in which we basically define an industry whose products are liked by everybody. So at the end of the Second World War, everybody likes Walt Disney. It's not a matter of taste. It's just something that everybody likes for the very simple reason that this is part of this mainstream culture. And by the way, it's interesting that it's focusing on leisure and not necessarily of cultivation of taste or cultivation of spirits and skills like the traditional notions of culture, and that's very important. It needs a very strict system of intellectual protection, copyright, and we will return on this in a moment, how much important this is. The problem is that, or not a problem, but the natural evolution is that this mainstream, the idea that the cultural and creative industry is basically a common space where everybody likes the same things, is broken at the end of the 50s with the birth of the subcultures and of the counterculture. And so even Hollywood, even the mass market, has to cope with the idea that there are now people who focus on completely different spheres of meaning that can be oppositional to others. So we create an ecology of meaning within the culture and creative industry, And this, of course, is very problematic for the culture and creative industry at the beginning because they have to adapt to a completely new situation, but of course they do. And the interesting thing is that this lays the premises for the social innovation that is biting so much today. The interesting thing of the birth of the subcultures is that people begin to be familiar with their own private cultural sphere of meaning that they share with some other people. But the point is that when you're part of this sphere of meaning, and think, for example, of subcultures, you're part of the punk culture. Let's imagine you are at the end of the 70s in London and you're part of a punk group. It's not simply that you stick to the language and to the conventions of your group. You speak your mind. It's part of the story. If you are part of this small community, you want to say your opinion, you want to give your view, which means that in this new situation, people start not simply to listening to stories, but they want to tell their own stories. They want to tell their part of that story. So what is being created through this is the idea that people are less and less a passive audience, and they start to become part of the story. They want to contribute to the construction of the story. By the way, exactly as it happened in the grassroots regime, okay? At the very beginning. Who understands this very well in the culture, in the mainstream Hollywood industry? George Lucas. Star Wars is the paradigm of this. It's a story which is manufactured to be completed by the people who are watching it. And basically, the suspended end of the first episode becomes the platform for developing a completely new approach that initially takes Hollywood completely by surprise, but not George Lucas, the fan fiction and so on and so forth. And this brings to the transition to the new regime we are entering now. So the interesting thing is that in the transition between patronage and culture and creative industry, by the way, when I speak of transition, I'm not saying that patronage is outdated. I'm simply saying that there is an expansion of possibility, okay? So, in the transition between patronage and culture and creative industry, we see that basically what happens is that the size of the audiences explodes. But in this new transition, it's no longer an issue of the size of the audience because the audience is now as big as possible. But in the new transition, what changes is the distinction between producers and users. So this distinction blurs. So you are audience, but you are also part, in some sense, of the story construction. You are enabled to participate in the creation of content. Today, we have software that enables us to produce at professional level, if we want, just everything from music, multimedia, text, cinema, whatever. And it's inexpensive, and it's quick to learn. So basically everybody today, if they want, have the possibility to produce content. And actually people do this. Not only, but with social media of second generation, you can really deliver this content to exactly the people you think they are interested in it. So you're creating a completely new situation in which now communities of practice become a new space for cultural creation and participation. So in the distinction that we have in mind, we know that there is generally the museum, the public financing on one side, and then there is the industry, the market on the other side, and we still delve into this contraposition as if it was all there is. But the point is that now there is a completely different situation in which these communities of practice are just blooming everywhere, and they are changing completely our own relationship with the museum, our own relationship with the industry, and just everything else. So the real point now becomes, first of all, to understand where this is going. And this is a long story. We are just at the beginning of it. The scandal of Facebook now, for example, it's an interesting hint on what are the real problems of this new situation, and the enabling platforms that are today providing the space for this new content generation to be distributed are also very problematic, but we don't have the time to really think about this. But the really interesting thing is that, and this is the implication that I would like to pursue, is that this is culturalizing the economy in a very strong way. If everybody produces content, the only way to create meaning and the only way to create value is basically to participate in this process of creation of content. So basically, culture, which is generally reputed simply as a type of entertainment in the traditional culture and creative economy is becoming today pervasive. Our understanding of things, our attributions of meaning to all kinds of products and experiences, name it, today have an extremely strong cultural basis, and this basis is dramatically escalating. So we are living in a culturalized economy in which the notion itself of participation is changing completely, and being able to tap into these participation processes becomes crucial for policymakers, but just for everybody that today want to have a socially sustainable way to create not only economic but also social value. So very quickly, do I have 5 more minutes? It's okay? Yes. Okay. So there are many different ways today in which we can create value, social and then economic value, through cultural participation. There are several areas, but I just want to show, well, that's see before. I mean, impossible to read, but at the same time, this is interesting, for example, in illustrating what I mean by the power of cultural participation to generate social and economic value. What you should, if you have a very good sight, see on the left is the ranking of the Innovation Union scoreboard, so innovation performance of EU 28 countries according to the 2014 data. And the interesting thing is that Sweden is the top scorer in terms of innovation performance in Europe, and there are, of course, generally criteria which are completely into the innovation performance category, like patents, expenditure on R&D, and so on and so forth. Then on the right, you have the index of cultural practice as computed by the Eurobarometer 2013 for the same countries. Sweden is also the top scorer on this one. But the interesting thing is that if you look at the two rankings, they look remarkably similar. And they have not a single bit of information in common. So, of course, we know from statistics that correlation is not causation, but certainly this is very intriguing. So, why this is so? One of the things that we are understanding is that cultural participation has a very interesting effect on people in this sense. When you participate in cultural experiences, your expectations are constantly challenged. You cannot be simply in your, let's say, comfort zone all the time. Because cultural experiences, when they are meaningful, have exactly this purpose. They want to, in some sense, disconcert you, even irritate you sometimes when they are really innovative, but certainly challenging this. Once you do this all the time, and once you are into the innovation game, like you are a bank officer, and somebody arrives with a weird idea for a new patent and wants a loan for this, it's a new idea. Should you be attracted or simply consider this with an open mind, or should you be scared? It really depends on your cognitive background. The more you participate in cultural experiences, the more open-minded you are. So the interesting thing is that cultural participation becomes a platform of pre-innovation. So the point is that in the case of Sweden, we think that part of the remarkable performance in innovation of Sweden, and more generally of Nordic countries, has to do with this. People get familiar with the idea of being challenged by new ideas. Whereas in other situations, in other geographical contexts, this does not happen at all. So, if this is the case, and we don't have now still a convincing statistical evidence of this, but Christer will show you afterwards what the experiments that we are doing now, for example, in southwest Sweden, that give us some hint on why this is true. This means that, for example, if through, one more minute and I'm done. If through cultural participation we can really improve dramatically the innovation performance of countries, what is the economic impact of this? Huge. Is there anything being sold or bought on the cultural side? No, it could be completely free activities. The only important thing is the behavioral change that they entail, the fact that they change the mentality of people. The same happens in the case of health, and this is the last thing that I say. For example, in terms of psychological well-being, we have been conducting as a research group a study on a representative sample of the Italian population. By the way, Sweden has been on the forefront on the experimentation of life expectancy linked to cultural participation. And pioneering studies on the end of the 90s have shown that there is a 2.5 increase in life expectation for people who have a regular access to culture. But the point is the quality of life. And we know that from the point of view of quality of life, cultural participation is more important to determine psychological well-being than income or age and education. Only the number of chronic diseases it's more performing in this regard. And this is, for example, what happens in terms of your psychological well-being when you increase the number of classical music concerts you listen to in 1 year. Okay? Dramatic impact. So, to conclude, this means that we can arrive at a cultural welfare perspective in which basically think, for example, of active aging. If we are able to show that by regularly accessing culture, elderly people go to the hospital, let's say 5% less, we have not solved, but we have half of a solution to the social sustainability of our welfare system. So again, are we interested in selling theater tickets to these people? Not necessarily. We are interested in having them participate and in having big social and economic consequence as a consequence of their behavioral change. The interesting thing is that if you do this, and if we have this exceptional saving of welfare resources, you can use the savings to finance all the culture that you like. So the real point is that you don't need to ask for financing of culture just because. But you can show how effective culture can be in solving some of the social and economic dilemmas that make this sustainable as such. And so, to conclude, at this point, we really have a completely different possible approach to cultural policy design that is not simply considering the traditional aspects, but it's considering the power of direct cultural participation in terms of behavioral change and in terms of the indirect effects that can be a complete game changer in the cultural policy of the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Sacco. I'm sorry to rush you through this. I just want to at least put one question to you. Do you think these economic values, are they going to happen by themselves, or should we have policies for them?
Now, policies are fundamental, and of course we also have to be careful, because there is also a dark side in saying that, for example, culture can be so effective in changing the welfare bills. The instrumentalization of culture. We don't have to say that since culture is good for the elderly, then people should go, let's say, to the theater, because this is simply destroying it. It's like when you hear a statistic about the fact that married people live longer and then we force everybody to marry. Well, that's not a good strategy, not even to obtain the effect that you have in mind. So, there is a very delicate balance from this point of view, and this is the purpose of policy. It's not to create a paternalistic idea that now everybody has to go to the, let's say, to the theater as they go to the hospital, but to create the conditions for people to discover this as a possibility for them, as personal empowerment, and so to create the behavioral and motivational conditions for people to, first of all, choose this opportunity because it's good for them, because they like it, because they enjoy it, because they feel relieved, and as a consequence to produce certain types of conditions. So it's very important that policy is careful in tuning this.
And these policies, are they supposed to be created by these people from the social, cultural institutions or by politicians?
More and more, it's a co-creation issue. More and more what we have to create, and this is, for example, part of the experiment that Christer Gustafsson will show later on, we have to create the conditions for people to understand the consequences of certain policy choices, and then to create a platform for a co-creation of policy, let's say, strategies as an evidence-based situation in which you understand the consequences of certain choices. Today, cultural policy making is very much about rhetorics. You want to build a new theater, so you start with very fancy reasonings that have nothing to do with the viability of that, what kind of people will actually take advantage of this, what is the financial backing for this. And as a consequence, generally what happens is that policy choices in the cultural sphere tend to be more personalized, so to speak. It's just because there was this kind of guy that was fond of theater that we have a new theater now. Yeah. This is terrible for our own credibility in the wider societal context today. So it's extremely important to switch to evidence-based social policy and cultural policy.
Thank you so much, Professor Sacco.
Thank you.